All right, well, thank you all for coming and inviting me here. I am impressed that you people are up to 4 hours of presentations a day. I think a lot of students who go to Willamette University don't spend that much time in the classroom. I'm going to hope to make this entertaining for you, and without getting any blisters on your feet, we're going to start out by talking about my most famous book. It was kind of the book that launched my career as a hiker. I had always planned to be a writer. My father was the editor of the paper here in town, but I didn't want to follow in his footsteps in a newspaper journalism. Thought that, no, that's too hard work. I decided I'd become a freelance writer, and so I studied creative writing back east at Cornell University, and then soon realized that it's very difficult to make a living as a novelist. My wife agreed to support me for 7 years in this, and it was at the bottom of the 7th year, I'd already written a novel or several other books, that I wound up doing this hike a little bit as a desperation move to, I figured I'd write 2 books, and one would be a guidebook to visiting the new wilderness areas in Oregon. This was 1985. They had just tripled the number of wilderness areas in Oregon. Somebody needed to do a guidebook to this. I didn't have a car. I figured the easiest way to go visit these places would be to walk through them all at once. From the westernmost point of the state through 18 wilderness areas to the easternmost point, alone with a backpack. And I have my family and friends meet me at mountain passes with food and supplies. So the other book I thought I'd get out of this was the journal of my adventures. And before going on the hike, I figured the hike would take over 2 months. I spent 3 months in the University of Oregon library researching all the places I'd go so that I'd have something to say when I got there. And so can we turn out the lights now? And I'll tell you a little bit about my other books first. This is my other adventure memoir, the story of this log cabin that Anne mentioned that we built using only hand tools. My father wrote a lot of columns about this for the newspaper in Salem, but there's no road. You have to hike in 1.5 miles, even today, and so we built it using only a crosscut saw and an axe. And we still live there in the summers. I just wrote a third of a historical novel about Vikings out there. It's a great place to work because you don't get a lot of people dropping in when they have to hike in 1.5 miles. And there's no cell phone coverage or anything like that. Great place to work. One of the novels I've done is not set in Oregon. This is the only one of my books that's not. It's about the greatest Viking burial ship ever found, which surprised people because it was buried for a woman. And my wife is Danish. So we took 5 trips to Norway and translated the sagas about this ship to find out the story of the Viking queen. And I'm working on a sequel for that now. But then I've done a series of murder mysteries too. And these have been great fun. The first one is about a missing Einstein formula for quantum gravity. That part is true. That formula is missing. It is not necessarily true that it could show up in a violin case in an attic in Eugene. But when it does, it causes all kinds of problems, and that's the premise for that book. The second in that series involves some of the same characters, is the great unsolved mystery of the Northwest. What happened to D.B. Cooper, the hijacker who parachuted with $250,000 and got away with it? Well, he'd be in his 70s if he's alive today, and perhaps, as in the premise for this novel, he's living in Portland in plain sight, but is being blackmailed by the Russian mafia. And the third is about the Rajneeshis. And this was a weird episode in Oregon history when this guru from India brought 3,000 people to the eastern Oregon desert, built a city there based on love and understanding, but one of his lieutenants wound up poisoning hundreds of people and trying to overthrow the government. So how do you make a novel about that? Well, the premise for this is that Bhagwan, who died 27 years ago and always said he would be reincarnated, has in fact been reincarnated as a 26-year-old barista in Northeast Portland. So they start up the whole movement and people start dying again, and my detective has to figure out what's really going on. So I am a 5th-generation Oregonian. This is the book I'll be talking about later today. the history, the human history of Oregon, wagon train routes and gold mining ghost towns and how to find them. And this is a scarier book, The Natural History of Oregon, floods, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, and the science behind them. Then a couple of books that cover the whole state. This is The Adventurer's Guide to the Wilderness Areas, and this is what my kids call the wussy hiking guidebook. And that's because I cherry-picked the most beautiful and very easy hikes and added all the other things to do, the hot springs and bed and breakfasts and towns and museums. And then this is a collection of the outdoor columns I've been writing for the newspapers in Salem and Eugene for 20 years. It's nice to have a Sullivan byline back in the Statesman Journal. But here in this book, all of those stories are arranged by month. So every month of the year, I recommend half a dozen appropriate things to do in that season. And then there's the series of 100 Hikes books, which has sort of become the source of my most widespread fame, is particularly among the Chemeketen hiking group. But this is the one I want to talk about today. And so to start this trip, I planned the route following the crests of 4 mountain ranges from the westernmost point to the easternmost point, put together my gear, which is a little heavier than it would be today because they didn't have such lightweight gear, and then set out on the first leg from the westernmost point of the state. And to do this, I took a Greyhound bus to Port Orford, which is the westernmost city in Oregon, and walked along the beach to try to reach the westernmost point. And along the way, realized that my maps were wrong and the entire Elk River lay between me and that headland out there. So I had to wade the river, and when I get out to the headland, there's a chain-link fence across the end of it and a sign saying, Coast Guard property, trespassers will be violated. Well, not violated, prosecuted. But I see 2 people beyond the fence. I say, how did you get through without getting arrested? They said, oh, we're from the Audubon Society and have gotten permission from the Coast Guard to look out here for vagrant yellow warblers. I said, well, could I come look for yellow warblers too? They said, well, I don't see why not. And so we went out and found a few of these birds out there, and also I put my foot on the westernmost point of Oregon's coast, turned around and headed inland, now marching, singing The Happy Wanderer. And after just a few miles, my shoulders are really sore. This pack weighs 60 pounds, and so I sat down to rest beside a pioneer cemetery, and see the tombstone there has my name on it. William Sullivan died at the age of 86 years. I thought, well, with this behind me, things can only go uphill from here. So I hike on into the first wilderness, which has a difficult story because the Grassy Knob Wilderness had just been designated, but the battle to preserve it was so violent that the head of the Forest Service for this area built a logging road through the heart of the wilderness to try to disqualify it from the Wilderness Act. And when the Congress heard about this, they were so outraged that they called it legislation by bulldozer, that they hadn't even thought they'd put Grassy Knob in the wilderness bill, but they put it in anyway. As a result of this, that road has been barricaded, has gone back to nature now. And so there really are no trails in that area, and it's a pretty remote place where you wouldn't expect the Japanese to have targeted and bombed it in World War II. And here we are at Tokyo University. It's perhaps, I think, appropriate to remember this particular incident because the pilot who targeted and bombed Oregon became a hero in both countries, Nobuo Fujita. And I'll tell a little bit more about him when I talk in my next session about hiking Oregon's history, but suffice it to say that he dropped 2 bombs in Oregon. These were the first targeted attacks on the U.S. since the War of 1812. There were also balloon bombs that were random, but these were targeted, and they targeted the wilderness. And the goal was to start a forest fire and detract from the war effort. But the one that he dropped on Grassy Knob did not go off. The other one did. But this one did not go off. It is still out there, a 500-pound incendiary bomb. Someday, someone may find it and blow it up. It may start a big forest fire. It may kill somebody. It is now in this wilderness, and it is one of the enduring mysteries. What happened to the bomb that he dropped there. Well, I managed to avoid that bomb and get down to the town of Agnes, Oregon. This is the whole town. And then at this point, this is where it's on the Rogue River, and there's a Rogue River trail. But rather than follow that, which wasn't going the way I wanted, I went up the Illinois River Trail. And the Illinois River Trail is much wilder. You'll see these western fence lizards along the way, a lot of wildlife and not many people. In this slide, maybe you can tell me what is indicated in this picture. It is not my knife. That is there for scale. There's something else. Can somebody tell me what it is? Bigfoot? Not Bigfoot, but you're right about it being a track. It's the track of a black bear. This is the rear paw of a black bear. And I actually saw more bears than people in this. The score was 5-1. And these cubs were right in the trail on a steep slope, and they scrambled up a tree that was hanging out over the trail. There's no way around that because it was such a steep slope, and I didn't want to go backwards. But you know, the thing that they tell you is most dangerous is if a mother bear comes and defends her cubs. Well, I figure I'll just go under the tree real quick and hope she doesn't show up. And of course, that is when this giant black bear comes roaring down the trail at me. She gets 30 feet away from me and lunges, but not at me. She lunges at the tree and climbs up past her bear cubs and clings to the treetop, quivering with fear. She wanted to be near her cubs, but she was terribly afraid of people. And this is true. Black bears are very, very afraid of people and have never attacked or actually never killed anybody in Oregon's history. Not one person has ever been killed by a bear or a cougar. There's another myth that goes down. It turns out that mother bears are not going to attack you even to defend their cubs. Oh, well, wilderness is not really as scary as people make it out to be once you get to know it, unless you're talking about the people out there. And they are the most unpredictable animals out there. The Illinois River Trail gives up following the Illinois River. It's too rugged, and climbs 3,000 feet over Bald Mountain. And there I meet Lou Gold. And Lou Gold has been camped there for several years. He is an Earth First activist who is there to try to stop the Forest Service from bulldozing a road that would cut this area off from the rest of the Kalmiopsis wilderness. And he has been in federal court, and the judge told him that his fine for chaining himself to the bulldozers was that he could never go back to this wilderness. So now he spends every summer there and carves these peace sticks, and later ran for the U.S. Senate in Oregon and came in third. So who can tell? But he has all of these peace sticks that he carves and gives one to everybody who walks by. And he had a lot of them, and nobody was coming by. So I took one of his sticks and walked down into the Kalmiopsis wilderness. Now, this is the largest roadless forest in Oregon, and it's a pretty wild place. It was an island in the Pacific Ocean for millions of years. It docked to the North American continent a few 100 million years ago, but it still has strange plants and animals from its island existence. These are Darlingtonia, the pitcher plant that makes up for the incredibly poor soil of this area, this peridotite soil, by catching its fertilizer. And it has a little hole underneath this hood with a honey smell that comes out. And flies and bees land on this landing platform which the plant has grown just for them. And they go in the hole looking for the honey. But then they wind up getting confused up here by these little windows on the top and going down the throat. And that's a one-way trip because there are little hairs on this throat that point down. So it's very easy to go down, but very hard to come back up. And then they drop into a puddle of goo where enzymes dissolve them for nitrogen. Now, this is not really a danger to hikers, but these plants have been known to catch grasshoppers and even frogs. So I encourage you to keep your pets on leash. Well, the bigger danger I found was running out of water. The trails are mostly up on the ridge crests, These were built by gold miners' burros a century ago and don't pass water sources. At lunch, I left my water bottle while I got my granola out, turned around, and the water bottle had tipped over and emptied out. It was over 100 degrees. I had no water. I looked up my map. I had to find water somewhere. There was a rarely used side trail going down to Baldface Creek. So I took that trail, my mouth dry, absolutely just like cotton. And just before I get to the creek, there's a rope across the trail and a snarling dog, and this guy comes out, looks like he's coming out of the jungle shelter from Vietnam, which turns out is about right. And he's got a big 45 and an ammo belt across his shoulder, and he says, "What are you doing here, man?" I say, I'm just hiking. I'm just hiking through. He says, "No, you're not. You're going to stay and have lunch." I said, "Okay, let's do lunch." So I sit down. This guy's incredibly nervous. The gun is always right there. Turns out he's also got a poison blowgun of South American design, with also not comforting. And as I talk to him, I gradually find out that he is a marijuana grower, and that he had thought that I was a SWAT team that had been sent in to try to arrest him. And when I convinced him that I was a writer and not a pot pirate or a policeman, he told me his whole story and shared his lunch and cocoa, not any pot though, and told me that he had been there for 4 months and had only met 5 other people, and they were all other pot growers. And so he was actually pretty lonely. And he agreed, we struck a deal, that I could tell his whole story in my book and print his picture if I waited 3 years. And if I didn't wait 3 years, the deal was that he would kill me. I said, "Oh, that works for me." He said, "Yeah, I've got the poison blowgun. You'll be giving a talk, like maybe at a university for, retired groups. And there'll be this poison blowgun will go through, you won't even see it, and then that'll be it." So I kept my end of the deal, and I hope he's keeping his. So I left the Calmy office where the sun still sets into the Pacific Ocean and followed the crest of the Siskiyou Mountains, where there is no trail, up to Red Buttes. And I was looking forward to that because the Red Butte Wilderness is where my route joins the Pacific Crest Trail. And this is like a wilderness freeway compared to the bushwhacking I've been doing. It's a 6-foot wide trail that's 2,000 miles long, goes all over Canada to Mexico. And I'm only on it a few minutes when this man walks up and says, "Oh, hello, my name is Chris Binns. I'm from Yorkshire, England. There are several hundred of us chaps who are hiking this because it's the longest trail in the world." And it turns out he's going from Mexico to Canada, and I'm going from the Pacific to Idaho. But our paths follow each other for a while, so we hike together for a while, and I hear his stories. And then wind up camping atop Mount Ashland, the highest peak in the Siskiyou Mountains. But in the background is Mount Shasta, which is twice as tall, 14,000 feet high. And whenever I take these pictures, I'm doing it by setting up my camera on a rock with a 10-second release and rushing over to there to pretend that I'm cooking dinner naturally. So here I leave the Siskiyou Mountains and enter the youngest mountain range, the Siskiyous being one of the oldest in Oregon. The youngest mountain range is the Cascade Range. And here I'm following the Pacific Crest Trail and figure I can make some miles. It's actually doesn't have a lot of water. It was built on the crest of the range, mostly as a bypass. When they built the Pacific Crest Trail in the 60s, they built it to avoid all of the lakes and fragile areas, and as a result, it is not the prettiest trail or the most interesting in Oregon by a long shot, but it's disconcerting from the other point of view that there really isn't much water. And here there was a 20-mile stretch with no water as I crossed the lava on my way to Mount McLaughlin there. And they had to actually use dynamite to blast out the Pacific Crest Trail on level ground because the lava was so rough. So I get as much water as I can at one spring and then hike 25 miles to the next spring. You know, I hadn't really planned on hiking that much. I had calculated that I'd need 19 ounces of food a day and had weighed that out very carefully. But when you're hiking 25 miles a day, you get really hungry. I was thinking about this porcupine. They are protected in most western states, not for their own sake, but as a source of wilderness food for lost backpackers. It's actually, they don't run away. You can hit them on the nose, flip them over and skin them up and eat them. I was not that hungry yet, but I did have these waking nightmares of pizzas and hamburgers that were floating ahead of me down the trail. You'd think that would have been a clue that I was losing weight. But no, that didn't occur to me. And then I'd started in August, which was really too late. It was September, and boom, it started snowing. I went around Crater Lake when you couldn't even see the rim. You couldn't see the lake itself, and in this sleet. And I have my waterproof coat on there. I keep my hands in the pockets to try to keep my hands warm. Notice it's not really helping. Look down and realize that my pocket is full of ice water that's run down the coat, and I've been keeping my hand in that. So I finally build the first campfire of my trip. And I don't recommend ever using campfires in the wilderness. You can do that in car campgrounds. That's fine. But in the wilderness, fires leave a scar, and they burn up wood that is needed for other things, for the animals that live there, and is scenic for other values. But if you are cold enough and wet enough, then a campfire makes sense. So I was there in the Mount Thielsen wilderness here at the Maydew Lake Shelter, and thinking about the things you can do when it rains in the Cascades, because this is a lot of the time. One thing you can do is notice the lichen. Now, lichen is a mixture of algae and moss and some enzymes. This is Alectoria, or witch's hair lichen, and it is a good gauge of the snow depth in winter. It won't grow below the snow level. So here you can see the snow is 6 feet deep in winter. I nicknamed it the toilet paper lichen, and I won't tell you why, other than to say you can't take everything with you on these trips that you might need. The other thing I noticed a lot in this weather was this, and of course these are mushrooms. This one is a giant puffball mushroom. It weighs 18 pounds. You make mushroom soup for the whole neighborhood. And then I saw, and you don't want to get these. I know enough about mushrooms to avoid the fly amanita with the little polka dots. It looks like a fairy tale mushroom, but if you eat it, it'll put you in the land of fairy tales. It is fairly poisonous. Was used by the berserkers in Viking age to make them invulnerable to the pain and willing to commit suicide. And then I saw these, King Boletus, the king of edible mushrooms. This is a mushroom that chefs in Paris would die to get a good supply of, and I had armloads among them. They were very small, but I gathered a bunch. I was so hungry, camped there at Summit Lake, very remote spot, and cooked them up with my ramen noodles. And they didn't have much flavor, but I didn't care. I was so hungry, I wolfed them down. And that night, I became violently ill. I had a lot of time to think about those mushrooms. You know, you should never eat mushrooms without a guidebook, and I thought I'd known it pretty well, but there are so many different kinds, and there are so many different kinds of poisons in mushrooms. Some of them kill you right away, some you appear to get better, but you've got gradual cellular deterioration and you collapse all at once later. In the morning, I spent the night vomiting out the tent flap. I got 1 hour's sleep, was unable to eat anything after that. And in the morning, I had time to think about these, and I realized that I'd gotten them when they were so small, it was hard to identify them well. And maybe when they got bigger, they'd turn into these ugly red boletuses. I couldn't remember how they were toxic, but I knew that they were not edible. And then in the morning, it had snowed 3 inches. On top of my other problems, the trail was now difficult to find. There were blazes I could follow for a ways. I looked at my map and realized it was 17 miles to the nearest plowed road at Willamette Pass, and I have to cross the Diamond Peak Wilderness to get there. I put together my pack.
I could not face breakfast, so I swallowed hard candies as if they were medicine pills, and then slung the pack up on my back and collapsed on my knees. Didn't have the strength. I had to lock my knees and walk stiff-legged up the trail, and up, and when I got past Timberline, there were no more blazes. And then there was almost a foot of snow. So I couldn't see the trail. I could be anywhere. I just collapsed there in the snow, took out my journal, and with the pen in my fist, started writing what I thought might be the last entry in that journal, where they'd find me a week later. I told my wife, don't come looking for me unless I miss a checkpoint by 2 days. Well, my next checkpoint was 5 days away. It'd be a week before they started looking. And then a gap opened in the clouds right above me, and there was Diamond Peak. I was not lost. I was at the highest point of the trail. All I had to do was keep going downhill, and I would get out of the snow. So I put the pack back on, I fell, and I stumbled, and I rolled downhill and wound up down at Willamette Pass, stuck out my thumb to hitchhike home. For an hour, cars just roared by, spraying sleet at me. I walked into the ski resort, which amazingly was open there, and looked at myself in the mirror and realized why these cars were not picking up this hitchhiker. I looked and probably smelled a lot like Sasquatch at that point. So I called my wife. They had a phone there, and she said, don't move. I'm sending someone to get you. And they came up, and I spent 3 days in Eugene recovering. Found out that the mushroom was not poisonous, but it wasn't edible either. And like most of them, it just made me throw up. So, in a way, I was lucky. But then after 3 days, I went back to exact same point I'd been, picked up my walking stick, and continued. And there was still snow. And this was it. I was ready to be done with snow, because here it is, early September. So I'm ready to turn east. And at this point, I do. The trail I'm leaving, I'm following now has been the Pacific Crest Trail, but I leave it now and bushwhack east, headed for the Ochako Mountains. And on that day that I headed east, the weather changed from what looked like winter to 2 hours later, what looked like fall, and 2 hours after that, I was back in summer at the Metolius River. It was just like reeling backwards through time. And here I could look back at Mount Jefferson. It might still be snowing up there, but I was out in the desert where it was warm and sunny, and headed past Smith Rock and into the Ochako Mountains. I'd never been to the Ochakos before and had sort of heard that they were desert mountains, but here's Black Canyon Creek, and obviously it is not a desert. This is in the Black Canyon Wilderness. The difference is that when you get above the creek, the landscape looks a lot drier. So there's pines in the high mountains, and then sagebrush and some deciduous things along the creek. Beyond this is Strawberry Mountain, the Strawberry Mountain Wilderness, with this beautiful lake. And it was named, it has obviously a lot of water too, but it was named for the strawberry plants that grow there. And when I was there, the leaves were turning red, but in spring, early summer, they actually have strawberries growing all over. The person I met in the Strawberry Mountains Wilderness was not identifiable immediately as a person, because he had covered his whole face with a camouflage balaclava, had camouflage gloves, and was sitting in a treetop. But he turned out, when I noticed that this was a real live person, he said something. I said, hello, who are you? And he explained that he was a captain of the Portland Police Department. And this didn't help much either. But it turns out he'd been hunting elk there with a bow and arrow for 17 summers. And this is pretty dedicated about this. He would take a bath in each morning, and then scent himself with the musk of a cow elk in rut, which you notice from quite a distance away. And then he would seatbelt himself up into the treetops on a little plywood platform, waiting for elk to come by underneath him so he could shoot them from above. I said, do you get a lot of elk this way? He said, no, last year I got my first. But it's not how many you get, it's how you do it that matters. And I had to agree with him there. Then my route now follows the Blue Mountains. And for this, I was I was very excited because the Blue Mountain Trail is a well-known concept. I thought it'd be like the Pacific Crest Trail, but before going on the trip, I decided I should call ahead to the Blue Mountain Trail's chief promoter, a man named Lauren Hughes in La Grande, and ask him about trail conditions. And when I got him on the phone, he backpedaled furiously. He said, yes, we've done a lot of research and planning about the Blue Mountain Trail, but we haven't actually built any of it yet. We're very excited that you're going to hike the whole thing because you'll be the first. So that isn't exactly what I had in mind. The Blue Mountains were named by the Oregon Trail pioneers who saw this blue silhouette in the horizon. It was much more feared than the Rocky Mountains. They could roll over the Rocky Mountains in their wagons. They did that in August. But when they got here, it was September, October. And if they met snow in these mountains, they could be locked up for 10 months. And down there is the North Fork John Day River in the North Fork in the John Day Wilderness. And that turned out to be a very nice trail and still is today. A lot of it follows old flumes, water ditches that were built by gold miners over 100 years ago in that area. The problem with this part of the world, out in the Blue Mountains, is that it has no respect for the freezing point. In Western Oregon, the temperature gets down into the 40s and then slows down and it almost never freezes. Over there, the temperature plummets right past 32, and lo and behold, it started snowing. And there I am, and I've already, done my hike in the snow, and there's no even flat spot to put a tent. And I'm wondering where I'm going to spend the night down there in this canyon when out of the snow appears this little log cabin, and on the door is a note that says, "Welcome to the Bigfoot Hilton." And it turns out it's a gold miner's cabin, and he's tried to lock the door to keep people out, and that didn't work. So instead, he's welcoming them in. And so I spent a day in the cabin hoping that everything would thaw, but it did not. And the next day, I had a checkpoint at Anthony Lake to meet my parents, where they'd resupply me with food. I was running out of food. And noticed on the map that Anthony Lake is a ski resort in winter. This is not a good sign. And it's 19 miles away, but I have to make it there. I have to get there. So I set out, and the snow deepens as I get up to the crest of the Elkhorns. It's now over 1.5 feet deep, deep enough that it covers the logs that are fallen down there, and you trip over them and sprawl in the snow over and over. When I get to the Anthony Lake guard station where I'm supposed to meet my parents, it's boarded up for a winter, the sign saying, "See you in the spring." And it's 19 degrees. Snowflakes are materializing in the air. I'm out of food. I'm cold. I'm ready to give up. I don't know what I'm going to do when I hear this clanking noise in the distance. Just clankety, clankety, clank. And it gets a little louder, clankety, clankety, clank. And down the road came my parents' little underpowered Japanese compact car. It's plowing the snow ahead with the front bumper. The doors open and they leave 2 white arcs in the snow. My mother gets out. She has plastic bags tied over her shoes with rubber bands. And my dad says, "Oh, we're so glad to see you, son. We were afraid you wouldn't get through." I said, "Well, me, how did you get through?" He said, "Well, we just had to. We had to clear the road for the television camera crew." And lo and behold, the next car up is a van from KOIN TV in Portland, and they set up the camera, and then suddenly I'm being filmed for the 6 o'clock news in Portland. This is a little disorienting for a guy who had just planned a starvation hike in the snow to find himself, in thousands of Portland homes. But they had great material there. This Anthony Lake is a very beautiful spot in winter. And I did get my supplies and decided to keep on hiking because the snow would be less further along the trail, and that was true. Here I have snowshoe hare tracks following my tracks, and I crossed the Grand Ronde River at the same place that the Oregon Trail crossed the river. The pioneers dragged their wagons across that and went straight up that hill. But my route is actually the opposite. Instead of going westward, I'm going eastward. Instead of looking for civilization, I'm looking for wilderness. But I kind of follow their route for a while into the North Fork Umatilla wilderness here. And then I reached the end of the Blue Mountain Trail after a lot of bushwhacking in the ghost town of Flora. This is the old schoolhouse in Flora. There's also a church over here. The whole side of it was knocked out by a rancher who uses it for storing tractors. There is a little tavern in the town, population I think about 5. But you know, the waitress is out on the porch chopping wood. It's a pretty rustic spot. But I figure this is the last telephone I'll see. So I'd better call ahead to Lauren Hughes, the Blue Mountain Trail guy. And actually, I wanted to call back, I'm sorry, not to him, but rather to a friend in Salem who had planned to meet me at the end of the hike. And this was the Hyatts, Kim and Paula Hyatt of Salem. And when I called the Hyatts on this telephone, it was like calling the moon. You had to use a crank and then shout into the phone. And coming all the way out to Salem, I heard him say, "Oh, didn't I already tell you? I was out chopping firewood and felled a tree on my head. I've had some trouble with amnesia. Who did you say you were?" Well, Kim Hyatt is a guy who's got it pretty well together, but I told him to go to the hospital and see some help. Meanwhile, I'd find somebody else. And it turned out not a lot of people are willing to drive 11 hours to Hat Point on the Hells Canyon rim to meet me at the end of this hike. So I finally do call Lauren Hughes in La Grande, and he says, "Okay, I'll meet you there, but I have a jewelry shop that I run, so I can only get there on weekends. I'll be there in 2 days at Sunday at 5 o'clock, okay? Bye." Then I look at the map. This is like 100 miles. Well, he said 3 days, but it's over 100 miles. I'm going to have to hike more than 30 miles a day through Hell's Canyon in order to get there to meet my rendezvous, or I'll miss it. And if you miss your ride at Hat Point, you're not going to just thumb your ride home. There's nobody out there in October. So I set off on the last segment of my trip, crossing Hell's Canyon. It turns out it's not an easy place to hike. It has 5,000 feet of elevation. It seems like you're going up and down it all the time. I wind up down at the mouth of the Imnaha River, and the climate changes as you go down into the canyon. It's so deep. There's still monarch butterflies down there. Snow on the rim, but it's sunny and warm at the bottom. And down at the bottom there of where the Imnaha River meets the Snake, must be the quietest place I've been in Oregon until I heard this motor. And I look around there. Is there a helicopter? There can't be a vehicle. There's no road for miles. And then up the river come 5 jet boats loaded with tourists from Lewiston. The river is not in the wilderness. The banks are. And each one has a guide with a loudspeaker on it, and they're saying, "And on the shore, you'll notice this backpacker who's come all the way in here for solitude. Isn't that amazing?" So I'm thinking this is getting a little crowded. I hike over to the easternmost point of Oregon. My camera wouldn't take the picture because it was too dark. This is Suicide Point. It's not a place a lot of people go. And I camped there and then looked at the map. I had 24 miles to go in one last day and gain 6,000 feet of elevation. So join me as we do that last day. I figure, hey, I've done pretty well. Look at the map. At this point, you've gone up 1,000 feet. This is like a fifth of the way out of the canyon. 2,000 feet, there's a herd of elk that go across. You see the animals out there, they don't have forests to hide in. 3,000 feet, there's the Seven Devils in Idaho. 4,000 feet, that's my goal. That's Hat Point, the fire lookout tower up there, still with snow. 5,000 feet, this is the zigzag trail, they call it. And that's my route, is zigzagging along, getting up 6,000 feet. I reach there, and there's nobody there. I really kind of expected that. So I lean my walking stick against the post and decide to leave my walking stick there. It was at home at the wilderness. I'll leave it there. And I'm thinking what I'm going to do when up the road comes this pickup truck. The window rolls down and 2 hands stick out. One has a hamburger and the other has a beer. And it's Lauren Hughes. And he said, "I hope I didn't rush you getting here on a Sunday." I said, "Yeah, that's okay. I think that will give this book a fitting ending, a little more exciting." And so As I did that hike, I kept a journal along the way. Every night I would write for 2 hours, and because I was alone, I could collect my thoughts and write it all down. When I got back to Eugene, I typed it all into a computer and sent it off to my agent. She submitted it to as an auction in New York. 16 publishers bid on it. The highest bid was $25,000, which at that point was more money than I'd earned in my life combined. It lifted the threat I had been under from my wife, who said she would support me for 7 years as a freelance writer. That was close. It was the bottom of the seventh. But it also branded me as the hiker guy. And you know, I'm okay with that label, because hiking is a lot of fun. And so I have gone back to some of the most beautiful places in Oregon since then, rehiked much of that route and every trail I could find in the state. And I do that all summer and write guidebooks about that. But then in the winter, I have time to go back to my original passion, which was writing fiction. And that's a way of telling a different side of Oregon's story. Here I talk about the physical landscape, the physical beauty, but the people are also quirky, and our history is unusual, and it deserves study. And so that's why, for the second part of our talk, after we have questions and a break, I want to talk to you about hiking Oregon's history. I have a few more pretty pictures, and there we are. All right, thank you. So do we have any questions here today? We need microphones, okay. You have some microphones.
Yeah, hi, Bill.
Hi.
Do you,
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. My name is Stephen,
Hi, Steve.
and I listened to your other talk at the public library, I think in Salem, and I was looking forward to this.
Louder. Louder.
Can you hear a bit
Yeah,
better?
that's great.
Okay. I wanted to know what kind of conditioning did you go through? Did you just hike a lot, or is there any kind of training thing that you've done?
Do I have any special conditioning? For that particular hike across Oregon, I practiced by carrying a backpack full of firewood, 50 pounds of firewood around Eugene, and I got so I could knock off 11 miles in like 3 hours, and I did that a lot. But it's still, in terms of conditioning for hiking in general, I think the main thing is to just keep doing it. Keep walking. It turns out if you ever stop walking, it's very hard to get going again. And the walking is, quite frankly, the best exercise. You don't need me to tell you this, but it is the best thing you can possibly do for you, physically, but also mentally. To get out and walk, you can walk away a lot of your frustrations. And I think those of us who are active as older people, that walking has played a large role. So the conditioning, I think, is just keep doing it.
yeah, hi, Bill. Do you know what the chicken of the woods is?
Yes?
Oh, because my brother and I used to hike in the Olympics. I loved that. And we used to find that and have that for dinner in the evening.
Okay, chicken of the woods is a fungus. It's a kind of mushroom. It does grow out of dead trees, and it's the only fungus that grows out of dead trees that's edible. And you can't mistake it because it is bright flaming orange and flaming yellow and red. It looks like the head of a matchstick. So it is completely unsafe from that. You have to cut off the tender parts and eat that because the inside part's woody. But you're right, there's usually like 5 pounds of mushrooms on one of those, and it'll grow back the next year. So that is a good, relatively safe one for non-experts to sample without taking like spore prints and doing microscopic studies of your mushroom to determine if it's safe. The other one that's fairly safe is a chanterelle. There are false chanterelles, but they're really different. So for beginners, I'd say stick to those two. Don't try the Boletuses. They are a really dangerous breed. oyster mushrooms are I found it's really hard to get them before the worms get them. They're almost always full of worms, so I haven't been able to eat them very well. Yes?
Yeah, this is George. In planning this trip, where did you get all the maps and material you needed?
I went to the University of Oregon Map Library and photocopied the topo maps. I couldn't afford to buy them all, but I photocopied them and I bound them together into 9 volumes that I had at each checkpoint. And those, and then I drew my route on it, and those are now in the Oregon State Library. If you go there and ask for the New Oregon Trail, which is what I called it, by William Sullivan, you can see the original maps that I took on that trip. They're preserved there. Any other questions? One more? Okay.
Is it my turn?
Yeah.
It is? Okay. This is Franca. Hi. Hi there, Will. I hiked with your dad, Wes, and I remember him saying, my son is hiking someplace in eastern Oregon right now, and I'm waiting to hear from him, so I feel like I have a real connection there. But you said to get to your cabin you hike in, but we paddled in a while back, and had tea and cookies. That was a really nice, day. So my question is, I'm a kayaker. I've gone from years of hiking and then discovered kayaking. And are you ever tempted, even though it may not be your primary activity, have you ever been tempted to do something for us kayakers?
Yes, and I have worked with Laurel and Shellen here in Chemekinen, who leads all the kayaking trips and canoeing trips, and doesn't lead them anymore, but she did. And she didn't have enough material for that. And so I've encouraged other people to do it, and there is now a book finally out. It just came out this month, and I forget the exact name, but it's like paddle boarding and kayaking in Oregon, and it's just fine. There is finally a book about this. I argue about whether I would do that myself, but I've got my hands full updating all these other guidebooks and writing new ones. So somebody has done that now, and it just came out. One more question?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
This is Irene. It's about the water, and you seem to run out of water a lot or not have much water, but did you purify it? I know nowadays they have all kinds of ways of purifying water, and did you do that? It didn't sound like you were doing much of anything.
Yeah, I did purify my water when I needed to. The big danger is giardia. This is a paramecium that is spread in the feces of mammals. And that's important. So if there's even a chipmunk upstream from you, it could well have giardia. Half of the dogs in Oregon have giardia and are carriers. So people who take their dogs with them up there are spreading this all over the wilderness. It's pretty well covered the state now. And so you can get water from a spring or right off of a glacier or a snow melt where there's no mammals above it at all, and that you can drink. And I did that when I could, and otherwise I did have some iodine pills, and I boiled water sometimes, but that takes a lot of fuel. And now they have pumps, and the pumps force the water through a filter that will filter out the parameciums. They're fairly large critters, and it's pretty easy to filter them out, and that's what people do nowadays. Bring a quart of water from home, and then if you need more than that, bring along this little pump that will pump the water and filter it as you go. And then you're good. You don't want giardia. Beaver fever, it takes 2 weeks for it to show up, and then it's like malaria. It doesn't go away, it's diarrhea, it's bad. So don't just drink the water unless you know what you're doing. All right, and so that's our first half of the program. We'll take a little break and come back and do Hiking Oregon's History.